Welcome to the CEC Report, the weekly program of political and economic analysis by the Citizens Electoral Council, broadcast on Channel 31 and webcast over the internet. I'm Robert Barwick, and I'm joined each week by CEC founder and leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Robbie.
Okay, it's November 18, 2011, and today's report, we're going to discuss three things. 1, Obama makes Australia a nuclear target. 2, the bankers' dictatorship spreads across Europe. And 3, the Victorian Government confesses to murder. So first, Obama makes Australia a nuclear target. We've just witnessed an extraordinary whirlwind tour by Barack Obama that leaves Australia with a great big target painted on it. We have the bizarre spectacle that where Aussies greeted Obama as if he's the great hope that he pretended to be when he was campaigning for president in 2008, even though he is despised by his own population now after 3 years where they know he's betrayed them.
Just shows you how much doesn't come through of the actual truth of what's happening in the United States, Robbie.
Absolutely. And if you watch the normal media programs like The Project, etc., it's all pure propaganda. There's no reporting of why do people in America view Obama the way they do. Now, on this visit, the other thing we saw, which was an example of the betrayal of Obama, is that what Obama and Gillard did, and what they're doing to the US-Australia alliance, is a continuation of what Bush and Howard did to that alliance. In other words, use that alliance to go on a warmongering path. The opposite of what the alliance is for, the opposite of what they claimed they supported back when Bush and Howard were doing it.
I think it's also important early to state, Robbie, that Bush, Howard, Obama are British agents. They're not acting as Americans, because people get very confused very quickly about the fact this American is an imperial American system. It's not. What we're watching is the deployment of Barack Obama as a British puppet, as is Julia Gillard.
Well, what's the US-Australia alliance supposed to be, for example? What did Curtin and Roosevelt intend it to be? And what we know about Curtin and Roosevelt, what they intended it was to be an anti-imperial alliance. Yeah,
very much a pro-economic development, strengthening of the populations against, explicitly, the British imperial projects. Because Roosevelt had a lot of fights with Churchill in particular about the nature of what the world would look like after the war. Now, Churchill was a representative of the British Empire, a very staunch one, right? He believed that there had to be a continuation of the British Empire, with the colonies throughout Southeast Asia, throughout the world, in fact. However, Roosevelt said, no, Winston. He actually caused Winston to almost swallow his cigar, I believe. He said, after the war, Winston, we are not going to have the British 19th century methods. We are going to go with science and technology to develop these underdeveloped countries. So that's what Curtin actually represented here in Australia with the likes of Ben Chifley and the old Labor Party, was the development of Australia. And we saw this through the great post-war development projects that were on the table for the development of the country. We saw what Chifley and Curtin represented, and others, Essendon Lewis from BHP, of this understanding that to have a viable country in order to prosecute a war, but just to have a viable country anyway, you needed to have one that actually had a very strong physical economy. Now, it was the case before Curtin came into power. There was discussions early on in the war about him joining a national unity government sort of thing of doing deals, and Curtin wouldn't have a bar of it, because he knew that to compromise with Menzies would be the death of Australia, because Menzies was totally opposed.
Well, Menzies was in favour of the Brisbane Line strategy of the British to sacrifice Australia.
Yeah, and the Brisbane Line, of course, for those people who don't know what the Brisbane Line is, this was a policy direction of the British. Basically draw a line from Brisbane to Adelaide, and anything to the north of that was to be ceded to the Japanese. And as soon as General Douglas MacArthur came in, he saw this policy. He said, this is absurd. You can't defend Australia with that sort of a policy. And he formed a very unique and very close bond with John Curt. They worked together very closely, and they developed a strategic policy of island hopping, of going outside Australia and fighting and prosecuting the war to the north.
Now, just to clarify though on why we're saying that what Bush and Obama are doing is British and not American. People have to understand that the British view the world in the way that Thomas Hobbes laid out, that the world is a war of each against all, and in other words, think of the world where everyone's out to get everybody else, and so under those circumstances you're obliged to be imperial, in other words. And that's what has governed British strategic thinking for 400 or 500 years. And America, and Roosevelt and Wallace, his vice president, were specific about this, is the opposite.
Well, this comes in the context, Robbie, of the fact that the British Empire and its monetary system is disintegrating, as we've seen in Europe. We'll say a bit more about that, I suppose, as the program goes on. But the specific point is that Obama is actually targeting China. And we've been discussing on this program the fact that World War III, thermonuclear World War III, is very much on the cards as a strategic policy action of the British.
Let me just give some people details, and you can come back to that. This Darwin base, the Marines are called the tip of the spear of America's foreign policy. And what they've done by putting them in Darwin is they've taken them outside the range of China's missile defence. So America's got very big bases well inside the range, like Philippines, where they've been for 100 years. That's not a threat to China, right? Because China knows where the chessboard pieces are. But by putting them outside the range of those, at a time when in the other part of Asia, Southwest Asia, they're provoking an attack on Iran and Syria that China and Russia have said, we will not stand by and watch this happen. This is sending a very clear message to China. So go on.
And that's the strategic risk of World War III. I mean, there's so many troops stationed in the Middle East right now, in the Mediterranean Gulf region, in Afghanistan and so forth. You have this crazy Prime Minister Netanyahu who's just taken delivery of 500 bunker buster bombs from Obama. But and it only takes and there's exercises going on with Israel with some 5,000 troops right now. It only takes a small incident where something happens, and then all of a sudden you end up with something, like some Russian installation being bombed either deliberately or so-called accidentally, and then you start the scenario of counter reprisals, and this thing can escalate very quickly into what LaRouche calls one big blast, where you have just dozens of thermonuclear weapons flying backwards and forwards. But see, the very fact that these forces are positioned where they are is part of the policy direction of actually establishing the war, because the British Empire, with its crumbling monetary and financial system, can't have a stronger Russia and a stronger China collaborating with India and the Pacific nations dominating the world's strategic power base.
And that's where it's a very similar scenario to World War I.
Yeah, that's right. And see, I think people need to go onto the LaRouche PAC website, and particularly watch Mr. LaRouche's weekly report, where he goes through in great detail with the others on that report, what are the various parts of this this particular current strategic situation.
Okay, and also what I recommend people do, if you haven't already done it, watch the ALPAC video called 1932, because if you believe that what Obama and Bush before him are doing is American, you need to know what it means to be American, so go and watch that. And it's available on our website and on the LaRouche PAC website. So when we come back, we're going to discuss how the bankers' dictatorship is spreading across Europe. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Now, let's discuss the bankers' dictatorship spreading across Europe. Last week, we talked about this subject in the context of the toppling of the Greek government and replacing Prime Minister Papandreou with a former deputy head of the European Central Bank, after Papandreou tried to take the European bailout to a referendum. And of course, he was told Greece has no right to do this anymore. So this week, the same thing has happened, this time in Italy. It's funny to think about, but Berlusconi has been the longest serving Prime Minister of Italy since World War II. Usually they last a year or two at best. He's lasted more than a decade. Now, if he's as bad as they say, and not to you got to watch the media.
Why would he be there for so long?
No, exactly. There's always another side to the story. But anyway, this time he's been dumped thoroughly. And who's he been replaced by? But an unelected former EU Commissioner Mario Monti, and his status as an EU Commissioner is what's qualified him, who, in order to qualify to be Prime Minister, was appointed by the President Senator for life. So he's never been elected. He gets appointed Senator for life, and he's now the new Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Italy. So in other words, Italy's got their new Mussolini.
He's also committed, Robbie, to bringing in people that are not politicians. Like, for example...
Again, in other words, again unelected.
Yeah, again unelected. I mean, he's got a guy who's the former head of the Intesa Sanpaolo banking group. You know, his name's Corrado Passera. He's been stuck in charge of the new Ministry for Development, Infrastructure and Transport. This guy's a banker. So here you have a cabal of bankers basically taking over sovereign country.
And next year we'll be putting a bunch of Sicilians in charge of things. All right, there's a very important issue that people have to think through here. Don't close your eyes to what's going on. Don't be like a frog in the warming water. We are witnessing the spread of 1930s style fascism. It's now spread to Spain. And an expert commented this week when Spain all of a sudden burst back into the news because its credit rating was downgraded, the yield on the government bonds skyrocketed, and one expert who spoke to us said they're following exactly the same MO with Spain as they did with Greece and Italy. That is, downgrade the credit rating, jack up the bond yield, and remove the government. And if you want to see how the City of London thinks, take note of what Tony Blair's advisor, Peter Mandelson, his kinky advisor, they called Peter Mandelson Randy Mandy, when he was with Blair and he had to leave from his employer Blair and Brown under a sex scandal. He was on Russia Today this week and he bragged that what toppled Berlusconi in Italy was the, quote, democracy of the bond markets. So Craig, aren't these bankers playing the people for fools?
This is a tyranny of the financial system because the intention all along, and people have to think about this, is all along is to destroy national sovereignty. Now we published the Defeat the British Monetarism as a new citizen, where we go through the fact that the British Empire, or for that matter any empire, exists on monetary policy, where it takes money and uses monetary and financial instruments as a weapon to control populations. And that's what we're seeing here. The very fact that, you know, you terrify governments or the people into surrendering their sovereignty by putting unelected bankers that caused the problem. Both these guys apparently...
That's right, they caused the problem.
They caused the problem because they're both Goldman Sachs prodigies. Goldman Sachs is a criminal organisation that's been proven so. And here you have a criminal, you know, these people stuck in charge of running the country's finances. Why? Austerity, population reduction, destroy the sovereign nation state. And if people cop this, they're fools. They have to be.
Now, there's a couple of things that it brings up that LaRouche keeps talking about. One is, you watch it and you think, well, why are the people of Europe tolerating it? Now, on one hand, they're not, because they're protesting on the streets. But LaRouche's point would be that there is no institutional sort of like principle in the European governments, which are parliamentary democracies, the same as the American Constitution, which can represent the people in a crisis like this. You know, when the crisis is not on, the people fool themselves and think everything's fine. But when it's on, and then they say, well, why aren't we being looked after? What they discover is that their governments don't ever exist to look after them.
And because of that, people have been treated like fools. Are treated like fools. They're not educated to understand how history works. What Mr. LaRouche has pointed out very clearly in his recent publications and on the website is that what we're dealing with here is what's called the oligarchical principle, where you have an elite, in this case look at the oligarchs, look at the bankers, that believe that they are, they're responsible, they have the power to determine how people live or who will live. And therefore, in order to protect that power, they have to make sure that the people are stupid, that the people are dumbed down. You cut education, you cut development of science and technology so that you don't have masses of people that are highly educated, that are able to then rise up and smash that oligarchy that is actually right now, you know, subjugating, you know, billions of people. So what we're seeing is that process working out, and the intention is to kill people. Like the British Empire, through its representatives like Prince Philip, as we've said numerous times, intend to reduce the world's population down to below 1 billion people. How are you going to do that? Well, you do that by shutting down access to healthcare, shutting down science and technology, making our Earth vulnerable to the great galactic forces. And that's how you kill people. But more specifically, you also allow wars to come along, like this thermonuclear war scenario that is very, very dangerous at the moment, where literally you're going to see billions of people killed. But see, that's the policy of this oligarchical faction. They intend this. This is no accident. Yeah, they're mad, but they're mad because they're following the oligarchical principle.
And LaRouche would say that the place where the resistance has to start from is the office of the American president, because that's where the constitutional power is over the banks.
And that, see, the oligarchical principle was broken in the American Revolution. They had a revolution against this principle, whereby the American Constitution was established in order to provide a republic that actually looks after and demonstrates the development of its people. And we've seen that time and time again when the American republic comes to the fore under, say, Lincoln, initially under Washington, Alexander Hamilton, then Lincoln, and of course under FDR.
And you've got a president at the moment who's not implementing that principle. And that's why LaRouche says he's got to go.
Yeah, and he's a British
aside
stooge.
from the fact he's a Nero. All right. Well, when we come back, we're going to bring it closer to home. We have an important discussion about how the Victorian Government has just confessed to murder. Okay, finally, you may not have heard the news this week, but here it is. The Victorian Government has confessed to mass murder. If you aren't from Victoria, you may not know, but our nurses in this state are on strike, and they have closed 700 hospital beds. Now, these are beds for elective surgery. To oppose the nurses, the health minister, the Liberal Party health minister, David Davis, has accused the nurses of putting the patients' lives in danger. And I'll read you the quote. He says that closing beds kills people. And on the 13th of November, the Sydney Morning Herald quoted him saying, quote, "There is no safe way to shut or cancel or close down a third of the hospital beds in Victoria. I'm not prepared to stand by and wait for someone in Victoria's hospitals to die unnecessarily." End quote. So let's examine that for a bit. His government's about a year old. The Premier, Ted Baillieu, was previously the President of the Liberal Party under the previous Liberal government headed by none other than Jeff Kennett. Under Kennett, in the 1990s, 1,600 hospital beds were closed permanently. And then when the Labor Party took over in 1999 under Steve Bracks, those closures continued. The beds per 1,000 ratio continued to drop under Bracks from even above the national average to below. So when the nurses are striking, aside from a pay increase, they're actually pushing for, they're fighting against a further downgrade of nurse to bed ratios. But it struck me, not only was what Davis said absolutely hypocritical, but it's a confession to what we charged the Kennett government with, Craig, in 1997, that their budget cuts are the equivalent of Nazi healthcare.
Specifically, known or should have known the consequences of their action. Now he's saying he knows that his actions, or the government's actions, back then, will kill people.
What he's blaming the nurses for shutting down,
yes.
They permanently shut down.
Yeah, I mean, we go through this in great detail in this, our pamphlet from 1997, Australia's healthcare reforms, a Nuremberg crime against humanity, but we specifically quote the case of the Kennett government, because the Kennett government was directly inspired, you might say, in a negative sense, by a very fascist organisation called the Montpellier Society, and the Montpellier Society is an arm again of the Crown, which we've...
Well, let me correct your word. It's not inspired, it was ordered.
Ordered, yes, that's correct. Yeah, that's a better way of putting it. I sort of inspired in a silly way, really. But the fact is that these people act on the inspiration of this sort of rubbish. Of Hitler, which is insane. But you know, the policies of the Montpellier Society, which we go through in this pamphlet too, you know, slashes in healthcare is number one. Why? Well, they want to take out sovereign governments. They want to take out the role of the general welfare and put it into the hands of private corporations. So what Kennett did was he corporatised a lot of the hospitals. He shut down hospitals left, right and centre with a view to rationalising healthcare and actually outsourcing it.
And just on that, if you follow the news, there's a buffer between Davis, the minister, and the Nurses Union, which is the Victorian Hospitals Industrial Association. And this is this corporatising thing that Kennett set up, where these are bureaucrats who run the system like they'd run a business. And when Kennett set it up, it was him and people like Graham Samuel from Macquarie Bank, who later became the ACCC boss, who set up this. And actually one of Samuel's jobs was he ran the Eastern Healthcare Network, which was the first of these. So the nurses are trying to get Davis to be reasonable, but they have to go through this group who are now threatening, this corporatist group are now threatening a lockout of the nurses the way the Qantas boss locked out the Qantas employees.
I don't think, I mean, I know you know, various members of my family have been nurses, and I know the pressure that they're coming under trying to look after an increasing number of patients in hospital beds. The Kennett government cut 40,000 medical staff out of in 1997. We've had an increasing population. Now there's been various moves to outsource hospital daycare services, putting people in their homes and so forth. But the intention here is to cut the cost of the provision of adequate healthcare to ordinary Victorians and Australians. It's in the same mode of operation as Obamacare in the United States, where he's literally, they're putting a price on the cost of a life.
And the Nuremberg reference we make, Craig, people have heard of Dr. Mengele and Nazi doctors who did disgusting experiments on children, etc. But there are a bunch of other doctors at Nuremberg, Nazi doctors, who didn't do that, but they got hanged for withholding adequate health care. Yeah,
the inadequate provision of medical and surgical services when they knew that was vital for the population. So, I mean, you're talking about this is a big dispute on behalf of the nurses. They're fighting, okay, for a pay increase, but when you look at what nurses are paid relative to what they're actually doing, there's arguments when the police get increases as well, and others, that the idea of squeezing the people that are responsible for a healthy population all the time is disgusting, and it's also dangerous.
And it does reflect there is a cost of living crisis out there.
There is, yeah. Because look, Australia has had, up until this economic rationalist period, it's had some of the best hospital facilities, free medical facilities in the world. I mean, the Queensland healthcare system was one of the first free hospital systems in the world. Now that's been completely dismantled. Again, under these policies of economic rationalism, which is basically shutting down the government's role within the hospital system, outsourcing it, making it private. You've got large companies like May Nicholas come in and buy up hospitals. You've got pathology services outsourced to private companies in order to make a buck. And that's where, when you start to put a value on medical services based upon the profit of private companies, that's when you get into this Nuremberg, these Nazi principles, because you're putting a cost, therefore indirectly, but actually directly, onto the cost of human lives.
Okay. We'll leave it there. I urge people, you can get a photocopy of this from us if you want and see what we documented back in 1997. Also, I want to add, I've been shocked at the reporting in the Murdoch media about the nurses, as if the nurses are the worst people in the world. The nurses shouldn't be surprised. Murdoch and his son Lachlan were some of the chief funders of the Montpellier Society in Australia, so you can look up that material in our literature as well. So that's it for this week's CEC report. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more developments.